Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. If you're joining us on Instagram below or up here on YouTube, hello. This is a weekly Introduction to Philosophy and Theory lecture series that I've been hosting for the past 2.5 years. The classes are entirely open access and free. They're designed for beginners, but let's face it, are also meant for slightly more advanced students. I tend to think of them as graduate level lectures rather than complete beginners lectures. And if you'd like to join me today, I'm going to continue a lecture series that I've called The Divine Madness. And today we're going to be covering why Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, refers to himself as a Christian atheist, why he argues for the monstrosity of Christ. I'm going to try to explain why Žižek believes that Christ is monstrous. And along the way, we're going to talk about the relationship between materialism and idealism and many other topics. If you are new to this channel, hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. I used to work as an educator at the University of Oxford Brookes and the University of London. During the pandemic, when the lockdown forced my classes to go online, I decided to start hosting free and open access live stream lectures to introduce people to philosophy and theory. I've never looked back, and since then I've pivoted to making open access educational videos here in our various online communities. So thank you everybody who has made this possible. Specifically, a huge thank you to our patrons who continue to support this project. I can't really believe that 2.5 years later I'm still able to do this, and that is entirely due to the generous support of the patrons who are really the key part of what allows this to keep on going. If you'd like to become a patron, you can access my lectures as audio downloads. That's more than 100 lectures at this point, as well as a recurring ebook subscription where I post accompanying ebooks for each and every lecture series. Look out for the current one, which is called And Yet It Moves, 5 Lessons on Žižek. And there's a whole bunch of other community features that you can access. So if you'd like to join our learning community, and if you'd like to help me keep making these videos open access, please do consider becoming a patron. It helps a lot. I'll put the link in the description, or you can go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I also want to say that if you are joining us from somewhere around the world, please do drop a comment. It makes me very, very happy seeing that we are connecting around the world. I'm always very happy to hear where you guys are joining me from. It really gives me a lot of joy. That is really what excites me about this, is that we get to sort of enjoy philosophy and theory together simultaneously in many different places. So please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. I see Perth. Gosh, that is really very far away. Hello to Perth. Moldova. Hello, Moldova. Philippines. Greetings. Another student from the Philippines. That is quite wonderful. I see Seattle. I'm actually going to go to Seattle for 3 weeks pretty soon. England, London. That's wonderful. Pakistan, Poland. I'm going to be in London, actually, this fall. Really looking forward to it. Madrid, hello Madrid. Austin, Belarus. Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. Austin, I see you. Okay, so today I'm going to try to elucidate or explain in fairly basic terms some of Slavoj Žižek's positions on Christianity. And then in the latter half of this lecture, I'm going to try to sort of flesh those out a little bit and introduce some more complex elements. So I want to cut right to the chase. The title of this lecture is Christ is Monstrous, or the monstrosity of Christ. And I want to very briefly explain why Žižek uses this term and where he gets it from, because it's, of course, on the surface, a very provocative thing to say, to take one of the central figures of the Christian faith, perhaps you could argue the central figure of the Christian faith, and to label him as monstrous. And in characteristically provocative fashion, Žižek is doing something here that is likely to disappoint or anger both atheists and Christians alike. And yet, from a philosophical perspective, it's actually a really, really interesting idea. So I'm going to try to explain that here briefly. When Žižek argues for the monstrosity of Christ, he's actually drawing upon a Hegelian perspective on Christ. Hegel argues that Christ is monstrous because he is so ordinary. that it is the ordinariness of Christ, the blandness, the mediocrity of Christ that is monstrous, at least monstrous when compared to the sublime nature of the divinity of God. And therefore, the truly shocking thing about Christ isn't that he represents God, but that he is God. That is the outrage, if you will, the horror, the shock of Christ, which is to say, how can this contingent man, this seemingly ordinary person, be God or claim to be God? And here you can immediately start seeing that the Roman attempt to then label, and the Gentile attempt to label Christ as a Messiah figure, as an emissary of God, as a poor representative of God, is therefore precisely a way to try to ignore the more radical complications of the Christological argument, which is that Christ is God. And even today, in contemporary Christian denominations of the faith, this remains very controversial. The idea that Christ is God. You could even argue that evangelical approaches to living as Christ did and adapting a Christ-like attitude towards life, etc., essentially turning Christ into a self-help Messiah figure of yore, is yet another way of refusing, or at least disavowing, this central revolutionary principle, which is that Christ is not simply the form of that God takes, not the messenger of God's message, but that Christ himself is the very content of God, that Christ equals God. It's a much more radical thing. And therefore, Hegel is quite right when he deems Christ monstrous in his ordinariness, because he understands the full import of the conclusion that one has to derive from this radical message, that Christ equals God rather than being the representative of God. And Žižek actually has a funny way of putting this. I think it's quite clever. Žižek says, whilst the Greek gods appear to humans in human form, while the Greek gods appear to humans in human form, it is the Christian God who appears in human form to himself. In other words, that the central event of Christ is not the appearance of God to humans, but it's the appearance of God to himself. A self-reflective deity, a transposition of the ideal substance of the divine, of God, into the material container of the body of Christ, and therefore the transposition of Christ into the Holy Trinity, into that which is the sort of excessive plus one, the dialectical Hegelian Aufhebung that emerges from this unity of opposites. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to explore here, because that was introducing a lot of abstract elements, but hopefully that will at least give you a basic definition. Žižek therefore argues that Christ is monstrous, the monstrosity of Christ, because Christ is so ordinary. And it's precisely the ordinariness of Christ, namely that he is mere man, that allows the properly theological revolutionary claim to be made that he is not the representative of God, but that he is God. And the shocking element is therefore that God equals this lowly thing, this mere man. And it's kind of interesting here because Žižek describes himself, you may have seen this before, Žižek describes himself as a Christian atheist. And I think it's fair to say that Žižek has a complicated relationship towards atheism. The closest he's come to explaining his stance on atheism is to say that to be a true Christian today is to avoid institutionalized religion. And it's a very provocative thing to say. I'm not sure that most Christians would agree with that. And yet what Žižek fundamentally argues is that institutionalized religion has largely tried to disavow and keep at bay the more radical components of theology and of the Christian faith. And that therefore what most people experience as Christian participation in institutionalized religion is in fact reified bourgeois ideology, not in fact a more radical engagement with the philosophical and theosophical, did I pronounce that right? Theosophical premises within the Christian faith as such. In other words, that ironically, the Christian institutionalized religion as we know it today, in its political form, is a way of neutering the more radical messages that lie within the Christian faith as such. Therefore, Žižek's argument is that the best way to be a Christian is therefore to be a practicing atheist. But there's another more complex dimension to this as well. One side of the coin is therefore that one should, according to Žižek, avoid institutionalized religion in order to properly engage with the more radical component of the Christian faith. But the flip side of it is that Žižek also argues that one has to recognize the central truth of Christianity as being atheism. That's a huge and quite radical claim, so let's try to break that down bit by bit. Why would Christianity be atheist? Well, it goes back to this argument about Christ being a monstrous figure. And here Žižek isn't drawing upon Hegel. He's drawing upon one of his other favorite thinkers, G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton, the writer, theologian, philosopher, etc. And G.K. Chesterton argues that this moment in which God appears to himself in human form, as Žižek put it, that this moment is a temporary moment in which God himself practices blasphemy. In other words, G.K. Chesterton writes that God, for a mere moment, becomes a blasphemer, in that he appears to himself in and through Christ. That therefore there is a crucial moment in which God, for an instance, becomes an atheist. And this moment is the moment on the cross, the moment in which Christ says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" If Christ is God, then in this moment, God has forsaken himself, or at least has cast doubt upon his own judgment. And this moment of atheism, that is therefore entirely necessary for the unfolding of the event, which is the crucifixion, is therefore what Chesterton calls the obscene core of Christianity, in which God for a moment becomes an atheist. And if you're familiar with Žižek's writings on Christianity, you will see already that this is the language that he is using in his own analysis. The obscenity of Christian religion is therefore not a normative argument against religion, but precisely an engagement with the core of the religious event. And this is why Žižek can be a little bit difficult to access if you're not familiar with his writings, because the language that he uses, Christ is a monster, Christianity has an obscene core, God is an atheist, sounds like a polemic against Christianity, which in a sense it is, but it's done in a manner that is meant to uphold the radical philosophical core within Christianity. And so it's an engagement with Christian faith, even though on a surface level it appears to be a normative criticism thereof. Now, one of the things that Žižek has said is that he believes he is successful as a philosopher and as a polemicist when he is being rejected by both sides, when his words are being misinterpreted or taken out of context by both sides. In other words, that the task of the philosopher is not to argue for one side of the case, but to make an argument that is supposedly so original that both sides will draw the wrong conclusions from it. Of course, some people who don't like Žižek would say that he's a poor communicator, but I actually think there's some truth to this idea, that it's quite difficult to speak in a way that doesn't simply succumb to ideological preconceived notions. And so part of Žižek's analysis of Christianity isn't meant to simply fall into the line of sort of contemporary popular atheist polemicists like Richard Dawkins, but instead is precisely meant to engage quite earnestly within the Christian faith. In fact, one of the things that you can see throughout Žižek's books on Christianity, like I was just going through this morning for the lecture, The Monstrosity of Christ, this is actually co-written with John Milbank. It's essentially a conversation or a dialogue between two positions. And the same is true for The Puppet and the Dwarf. Not The Puppet, God in Pain. God in Pain is another one of Žižek's books on Christianity. Yes, here. I've actually got it here. God in Pain with Kuindzhi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Again, is takes the form of a dialogue. And so instead of seeing Žižek as this master figure who's telling people that they're idiots to believe, it's a very sincere engagement with the Christian faith and with theologians, except the language that it uses can easily appear to be normatively judgmental of Christianity. Now, when Žižek characterizes himself as a Christian atheist, what he therefore means is that on the one hand, he avoids institutionalized religion because he doesn't believe that it is the best way to engage with philosophy and theosophy. Secondly, he argues that the truth of Christianity is therefore a kind of atheist logic, a moment in which God for a moment stops believing in himself or becomes an atheist. And so what Žižek is doing here is that he's essentially taking Hegel and grafting it onto G.K. Chesterton, or vice versa. And usually he does this with Lacan, except when it comes to Christianity, it's usually Chesterton. We rarely see references to Lacanian psychoanalysis when Žižek is talking about God, which is kind of interesting because Lacan's theory of the big other and the fact that the big other exists is quite often misinterpreted as being a kind of atheist statement about the absence of God. In fact, nothing could be less true. Whilst Lacan is clearly not a religious thinker or someone who believes in God, Lacan argued vehemently against the existentialist idea of the death of God. He didn't believe that you could simply declare or announce the death of God, that this misattributed to God a kind of substantial idealism that had already passed away in the Christian event of the crucifixion. Therefore, when Lacan argues or jokes apropos the existentialists that they've declared the death of God but they've forgotten to tell God, what he's essentially saying is that the New Testament already declared the death of God. As Hegel puts it, what dies on the cross is not simply Christ, it is the God of the beyond. It's the God of idealism, of the transcendental hierarchy, the God who is all-powerful and all-knowing, and low, mere mortal man has to aspire to rise up into the heavens to meet him. Instead, in the crucifixion, we have the transubstantiation, or the sublation, by which God appears to himself in human form and therefore fades away. The ontological movement that I've explained before, which is really quite easy, but it sounds abstract, is that it is the ontological movement by which the fall retroactively generates that from which it is falling. Hegel's version of this is to say that paradise is a retroactive subjective illusion. For example, it's not that man falls from paradise. Strictly speaking, paradise isn't paradise while Adam is in paradise. It's only once man has fallen that paradise appears in its properly a subjective form. In other words, not in itself, but for itself. Christ, being therefore the second Adam, or the negation of Adam's negation, if you will, is therefore the sublation of the originary fallen Adam, namely the transubstantiation, not back into the heavens, not back into paradise. It's not that Adam simply fell off and that Christ restored him back to paradise, but that the fall itself is now staged within the subject of Adam himself. In other words, that the rise of Christ isn't simply speaking the rise of Christ into the heavens. It is the finding of heaven or paradise within man. And it's actually quite important that this isn't simply, like, one of the interesting things is a lot of people who criticize Christianity, which is a fair thing to do, but people criticize Christianity in terms of it's just believing in fairy tales and it's another form of fan culture, I think really miss, first of all, the complexity of these theological arguments, their close connection to philosophy, and moreover, the intricate way in which theosophy is connected to the very development of the way in which the world thinks about itself and about its politics and about who we are. That, like, you cannot understand art or politics or morality without understanding religion. And it's one of the, to my mind, one of the depoliticizing elements of contemporary post-politics, that we've convinced ourselves that religion is simply another form of fan culture, simply another form of entertainment that people consume in order to give meaning to their life. It's a way to neuter the metaphysical dimension within Christianity that is much more radical. Now, of course, to go back to Žižek's argument against institutionalized religion does this as well. In fact, you could argue that the central premise of institutionalized religion is to try to avoid people finding metaphysical bliss in other things. Like, think about it. All the sins are fundamentally things that exist on a metaphysical plane that could therefore be a substitute for organized religion. Like greed. If you eat enough, you find bliss in food. This is the metaphysical dimension. It's not that when you eat, you're doing something vulgarly material and therefore you are moving away from the ideal of God. It's the exact other way around. Once you elevate food into the sublime objects of your enjoyment, as it were, you've reached the metaphysical principle of food, which is precisely what the church wants to avoid. In the same way, greed is simply taking, Schopenhauer's a great line about this, where he says that greed is simply when you no longer can enjoy money in the concrete because you are enjoying money in the abstract. Again, it's the metaphysical elevation of what is otherwise a concrete thing. Not simply money, but money as a higher form or principle, money as your God. Think about sex. Sex and lust being another one of these sins that is essentially taking something that appears to be vulgarly material into a metaphysical principle. After all, the little death, the symbolic death that is staged within orgasm, is precisely this highest disembodiment of the self. And so the argument, and this isn't my argument, it's something that Žižek argues in one of his books, I don't remember where, is essentially that the whole Catholic or institutionalized religious attitude towards sin is precisely not that they represent mere material, vulgar deviations from the ideal. It's that they properly understand the threat of something which is material that is raised to the level of the metaphysical. And of course, this is also Slavoj Žižek's argument about the sublime object of ideology. If you've ever wondered what the sublime object of ideology is, it's simply the commodity form within capitalism. Sublime, for Lacan, is something which is ordinary, but it is raised to the level of the metaphysical. For example, like a relic. A relic is, strictly speaking, a piece or a fragment of bone or of a skeleton, but it is elevated into an object of worship. Now, the sublime object, that which is ordinary but is elevated into an object of worship, into an abstract entity within capitalism, is the commodity form. This is Marx's famous idea that everything that is solid melts into air. Therefore, in capitalism, when the real form of something has to be exchanged, it means that in order to exchange something, you have to create a value system, and this value system has to be upheld through bourgeois ideology. And therefore, the hard material substance of something becomes the abstract entity that ensures and guarantees value, therefore becomes the commodity. And the famous Marxist footnote on reflective determination is therefore that it is the subject who is therefore himself created as the commodity. That as the commodity becomes more abstract, man posits himself in this gap. Here's who I am. A simple way of saying that is to say, you identify as what you have in your bank account, or you identify as a businessman, or you start seeing a watch as a good investment for future generations. This is what bourgeois ideology is fundamentally. It's that the logic of the commodity infuses our social relations and the way in which we think about ourselves and about the world. This is the most religious attitude you could possibly have towards the world. And of course, it's precisely within this bourgeois ideological aspect that we start thinking that religion is simply another fan culture of believing in the spaghetti monster in the sky, so as to disavow the properly religious aspect that underlies the logic of capitalist accumulation and pursuit. This is also why Max Weber argued that capitalism is a cult, that capitalism, strictly speaking, functions exactly like an organized religion in which everyone is supposed to believe in the same things, worship the same things, and follow slavishly the incentive structures that will one day allow you to enter into the heavens. It's just that the heavens are now not a trans-dimensional place of worship. The heavens are a gated community in Florida where you can play golf every day. Now, let me bring this back to the argument. Apologies for the aside. Žižek has an interesting argument about God and video games that can actually be quite helpful in understanding his position. So, Žižek says, imagine that you're playing an old-fashioned video game where you're exploring the world, and as you go through the world, the images in front of you are rendering in real time. So it's like, I don't know, you play like an old Skyrim game or something, and the pine trees emerge in front of you, or an old racing game, and the track, the surroundings of the track sort of emerges as you drive into it. Everybody, I think, has experienced this at one point or another. Žižek uses this. I realize that my dog is at the door. She's very excited to come in. Should we have a brief break to see if my dog wants to come to the door? Molly, she keeps coming to the door.
I know, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
She knows
She decided she didn't want to be here. That's fine. All right, I'm back. We'll see if my dog Molly comes back or not. She was very hopeful of coming into the door. I hear the pitter patter of her paws. Apologies for the interruption. We'll see if she comes back. She got cold feet, as it were. So Žižek has this idea about video games where he says, when you're playing an old video game and the surroundings emerge as you enter into the space, we essentially have here a metaphor for how we access subjective reality. And Žižek says, imagine a god, a lazy god, who in creating the world decided that he wouldn't create it completely. In other words, that the more you explore it, the more it sort of visualizes or manifests for you. And that God underestimated human beings. And that as human beings have managed to discover more and enter into the subatomic levels of reality, that therefore God has been caught out in his own game, and that God is desperately trying to fill in these gaps that go deeper and deeper as we try to figure out what lies behind the veil. Now, Žižek says, while this is a fun mind game, we should keep in mind two things here. There's essentially two levels. First, there's the idea of the ontological incompleteness that would lie, therefore, beyond the barrier that God has created for us. This would mean that at a certain point, we would reach the point at which we've caught up with God. We've essentially found out everything, and we've caught God in his own game. He's trying to create new layers of meaning for us to discover, but at a certain point, we catch up with him, and he is exposed, as it were. Now we just have barking. We'll see. Jenny, do you mind?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
You're fine. I'm sorry we don't get to see a dog. Maybe she'll still show up. So on the one hand, there's two steps here. On the one hand, we have the ontological incompleteness that is posited onto a transcendental beyond. The idea being that someday we will catch up, that God can't stay ahead of us. Secondly, there's the more important, and this is the position that Žižek would endorse, which is to say that rather than transposing the ontological completeness outside the barrier of human perception, we have to transpose this gap into reality itself. What if it is not that the ontological incompleteness lies beyond human cognition? What if the ontological incompleteness is buried within human cognition itself? In other words, Žižek's formula, which is, of course, as we will see, a Lacanian formula, his formula is that we have to accept the ontological incompleteness of reality itself. Now, what is the ontological incompleteness of reality itself? There's a pretty good example here that I came across on the internet the other day, where a toy, you may have seen this, a simple Ben 10 piece of merchandise that made a sound. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a toy that made a sound. And someone can correct me here in the comments, I'm sure. And depending on which word you put in your head, it turned out that you would hear the toy saying different things. So for example, if you put the words 7 needles into your head, then the toy would say 7 needles. But if you put the word, I don't know what it was, masterpiece or something, someone will correct me in the comments, I hope. If you put the words masterpiece in your head, you would hear the toy saying masterpiece. Essentially, depending on what you primed yourself to think, you would hear the toy saying it. Thank you. Green needle and brain power. Thank you so much. Someone in the comments knew. Apologies for being ill-prepared. Yes, so the toy was supposed to say brain power. But depending on which word you primed in your head, you would hear it say brain power or green needle. And what's so fascinating about this is that, strictly speaking, it means that you have to fill in through subjective cognitive processes that which you are hearing. In other words, you're not simply the neutral, objective interpreter of the message that is being sent to you. You yourself are in the message. You are the message. Namely, it's not that there's an ontological completeness beyond your cognition. The ontological incompleteness lies within your own subjective stance. It has to be filled in. Now, interestingly enough, most of the online responses that I saw to this, at least the more philosophically oriented ones, said, this is a lesson about misinformation and how about our prejudices and preconceived biases lead us to see in things that aren't there, etc. That for different people, they could find different things in something. And to my mind, that might be interesting, but that's actually the wrong conclusion to take from this. It's not that there is a neutral truth, but that we somehow tarnish it through our subjective interpretation thereof, our preconceived biases. It's that, strictly speaking, there is no truth without this taint. Therefore, the objective isn't to eliminate the subjective preconception so as to allow us to reach the transcendental, pure object of human cognition. It's the other way around. It's that the only thing that is pure is precisely the universalization of this impure subjective stance on reality. Or, as Žižek puts it, the ontological incompleteness of reality itself. Ironically, most of the replies or responses to this green needle brain power thing still posited the idea that there was an ontological incompleteness that lay beyond our human biases and perceptions, rather than making the more radical argument that it is precisely the central truth of reality, that it consists of this gap that is being subjectively filled in, that there's nothing beyond the veil of this appearance save the truth of the veil itself, as Lacan would likely put it. Now, this actually leads us to another Chestertonian argument. Chesterton once quipped, and he actually returns to this frequently, that scientism and atheism was the supreme or highest form of irrationality. Now again, that's a very provocative thing to say. Why would rationalism be irrational? And yet what Chesterton means is that, he puts it this way, he says, actually I wrote it down because I want to make sure that I get it right. Yes, Chesterton says, the mystic allows, or actually, no, let's do it again. I want to actually get this quote right, because often I paraphrase quotes, but this one I think is quite nice. So Chesterton says, the morbid logician seeks to make everything lucid and succeeds in making everything mysterious. And then he writes, the mystic allows one thing to be mysterious and everything becomes lucid. Think about that quote for a moment. Essentially what he's saying, what Chesterton is arguing, is that the morbid logician, of course, the rationalist, the Enlightenment figure who doesn't believe in God, who's not a Christian, the morbid logician seeks to take away the mystical element so as to elucidate everything. And yet, as Chesterton often cautioned, he said, it's precisely this rationalistic attitude that makes you prone to believing in anything. Or as he put it, that if you don't believe in God, you're more likely to believe in anything. Now, of course, it's provocative to argue that believing in God is the highest form of rationalism, but he's actually making a logical formulation here. He's essentially saying that what the religious person does is that he allows one mystery to exist, the inscrutable, unexplainable presence of God's absence, if you will, the existence of his inexistence. Whereas the logician who seeks to turn everything into something which can be understood, thereby elevates many other things into superstition, into that which cannot be understood. Essentially, you could actually make an argument here about idealism versus materialism. Chesterton is arguing that the belief in God is therefore not an idealist superstition, but precisely a materialist gesture. That the upholding of one, let's say a +1 excessive master signifier of the faith, allows you to rationally survey the field of reality in front of you. Whereas it's precisely the ideological insistence that this gap doesn't exist, that this metaphysical gap no longer exists, that allows the return of the repressed, of sublime transcendentalism into ordinary superstition around you. Actually, I had an experience about this recently. As a rule of thumb, I tend to avoid Renaissance, metaphysical, Buddhist Zen bookstores. Not because I don't like them, but just because I know there's nothing for me there. I'm not a Zen Buddhist. And many of the books there tend to focus on people's pain points and how you can help yourself through healing and meditation, etc. All of which is quite wonderful and relevant, certainly to many people, but not so much to my own interests. However, I was looking for a gift card. And so in order to buy a gift card, the only store that I could find that had one was a Zen bookstore in Portland. And so I went into this Zen bookstore, and as I was browsing, there was a woman next to me with her daughter, and she had a statuette. And she asked the woman, what is the meaning of the statuette, the salesperson? And she said, this is a statue of a goddess who protects women and children. Wonderful. And at that point, and this is a true story, I was really shocked, but also somewhat entertained. The woman approached me and she said, excuse me, I don't know who you are, but my current journey, my practice, is to be more receiving from men. At which point I thought, wow, that's pretty weird. I said, okay, what can I do for you? And she said, well, I would like you to buy the statue for me. And I said, well, how much is the statue? And she said, $75. At which point I said, could I buy your daughter a book instead? And then she said, no, it has to be for me because this is the goddess of protecting women and children, and I would like you to help me buy it. This put me in a bind because I'm certainly not against protecting women and children. However, if I am asked to pay $75 for a plastic statuette in a Zen bookstore for someone who I've never met, I certainly start to doubt whether this is in fact protecting women or children or if I am being taken advantage of. And so what I said is, I'm buying this $4.99 gift card. If you can find something of equivalent value, I would be happy to buy it for you. I felt kind of terrible. I felt like I was being a bad person, but it reminded me of Chesterton's quote that if you don't believe in God, you are likely to believe in anything, which is to say you're likely to believe in a plastic statuette made in China about the protection of women and children, but you're also likely to believe in whatever self-help tutor told her to go out into a public place and ask random men if they could buy them things so as to be more receiving from men. Now, what I didn't want to do was, of course, disappoint this woman or make her feel bad in any way, but to my mind it pointed towards this Chestertonian belief that it is easy to succumb to all kinds of metaphysical illusions and substitutes and self-help gurus and superstitions that fill in what is supposed to be the rationalistic attitude towards life. Now, I'm not advocating here that people should join the Christian faith or that this is any solution. I'm actually trying to make a logical argument about the faith. So let's go back to that. Idealism versus materialism. The central principle of idealism, which should be rightfully considered passé since Hegel, is the idea of a transcendental truth, a kind of pure object of truth, a pure form, as Kant and Plato put it. And that we have to rise above and transcend and reach or be reunited with this form. There's a beautiful statue of a Buddhist monk in the Seattle Asian Art Museum that I find absolutely sublime, quite literally, in which we have a monk in the moment of transcendence, the moment of reaching nirvana, and half of his face is in ecstasy, like, ah, and half of his face is in pain, like, ugh. And his face is split. He's like a two-faced figure, and one part of his body is like graceful, and the other part is being pained and tortured. That, to my mind, is actually the most beautiful Buddhist rendition, even more than Buddhist rendition, of the moment of transcendence, of the transcendent. Namely, when you transcend the very logical order, the normative incentive structure of pain and pleasure as such, something which transcends bodily experience, which is therefore both pleasure and pain. And you can actually find this principle, of course, transposed into the Christian Catholic faith in self-flagellation as a form of desubstantialization or subjectivization and the pleasure within pain. In fact, this is one of the morbid elements of Catholicism, is that it understands perfectly well how much pleasure there is to be gained in pain. That part of the reason why the Protestant faith and many evangelicals are so suspicious of Catholics, a prejudice which exists especially in the United Kingdom still persists today, is that they're all a bunch of morbid hedonists who derive pleasure from things that ought not to be pleasurable. The Protestant evangelical incentive structure, that, however, lends itself perfectly well to capitalism, going back to Max Weber, which is to say that you will ascend into the heavens as you ascend into your business life as the bourgeois subject who works hard and toils and does works of good faith, etc. The Catholic hedonistic aspect of enjoying your own pain is therefore rightfully a threat within the Protestant incentive structure. Now, idealism, therefore, posits this kind of transcendental place that you can go to, the heavens or nirvana or whatever. However, the materialist gesture is to undermine this transposed place of ontological incompleteness and instead to transpose the ontological incompleteness into reality itself. Remember Žižek's two-point process. What therefore happens in idealism, materialism, is it's, and I want to be very clear here, materialism is not simply giving flesh or weightiness to idealism. One of the most vulgar interpretations of Marx that I'm surprised how many students and professors still find themselves parroting is that Hegel was wishy-washy mystical.
Connect to your Wi-Fi network. Open the Google Home app to reconnect to Wi-Fi.
Thank you, Google Home Network. I appreciate your voice coming to me from beyond. Excuse me. One of the misconceptions that I think a lot of people have about Marx is that Hegel is this mystical idealist who has to be filled in through Marx's, material economic analysis, and that Marx grounds Hegel, and that we can therefore cast off the silly metaphysical elements of Hegel, like where he talks about God as being the sewer into which all contradictions run, and that Marx, in a sense, turns Hegel into a proper, rational, analytically purposeful body of thought. And there's an element of this, of course, especially when Marx talks about his theory being a science. But specifically, this misses the point. The relationship between idealism and materialism is never that materialism gives weight to the mystical, floaty abstractions of idealism, it's actually almost exactly the other way around. Is that materialism says, in order to find the metaphysical, abstract woo-woo, the void, you don't have to look beyond the veil. It's right here. The void is in the material. It's here. It's not posited beyond. It's right in the things themselves. That's the materialist gesture. And think about it, you can find that in many different ways. Like, the more we discover about the human body, the more we delve into DNA and the more we delve into subatomic levels. The void isn't beyond, the void is within, quite literally, at that way. Theories of relativity do the same thing. You could argue that the increased digital revolution of digitization does the same thing. That increasingly the materialist gesture is therefore precisely the positing of a void that is within, a constitutive void. That the central truth of the material is precisely this gap that has to be filled in. Now, to go back to the toy, remember the Ben 10 toy that either said brain power or green needles, here we have the perfectly materialistic formula, which is to say, this gap has to be filled in, materialized through subjective cognition. In other words, it's not, and this is again why other commentators on the internet, to my mind, make the wrong assumption. It's not to posit an idealism of objective truth that we will access once we've cast off our subjective predispositions. It's the other way around. It's that the truth of subjectivity, the transcendental dimension, lies within this gap between our perception and the transcendental element. As Lacan likes to put it, the only universal is difference. Okay, we've covered a lot here, so I'm going to see if we can wrap things up because we're reaching the end. Thank you so much for your patience, by the way. If you've watched these lectures before, you will probably recognize that I return to these topics in many different ways. In fact, the way that I like to think about it, and apologies for editorializing here, the way that I like to think about it is that in the same way that you can light a subject from many different angles, I try to light these topics from many different angles, and they reveal different things depending what light you cast on them. So if you find yourself confounded by what I've talked about so far, that's perfectly understandable, and please consider, if you have the patience for it, to look at some of the other lectures, and you can start stitching it together. That is the central premise of this dialectical form of teaching, which is not simply to transfer or relay a summarized version of difficult concepts, but precisely to allow you to access by yourself these difficult concepts by means of seeing how they start connecting in your own mind. At least that is the lofty aspiration of this. Okay, enough editorializing. Back to the lecture. So let us end where we began, which is to say, there is something monstrous in Christ because he is so ordinary. And yet the monstrous element is the paradoxical process by which this very ordinariness reveals the truth of God, God appearing to himself. Now, we can return to idealism versus materialism. If the God of the Old Testament is the idealist father in the sky, then the Christian event of the New Testament, Christ, the crucifixion, is the materialization of God. And now, if you've followed me so far, you will understand why it is, strictly speaking, not simply that Christ is man, who is the material embodiment or messenger of God, but precisely that Christ equals God, that the gap left between God and man is transposed into Christ, that the void between man and God of the transcendental logic is transposed into Christ, and that therefore the central moment of materialism is the moment of the New Testament, not because we fill in the empty space of God with the material flesh of Christ, but precisely because the void of God, the transcendental void, is transposed into the flesh itself. A much more radical statement, way more radical, and one which organized religion has done its best to avoid us from properly accessing or reflecting upon through the many practices that we experience in institutionalized religion. It's a massive metaphysical leap, a complete inversion of the logical structure upon which philosophy and theology and metaphysics has been propagated. And so this is why Christ was considered monstrous, because if one properly understood the philosophical metaphysical implications of Christ and his claim that he is God, The entire logic of being has been inverted. It's a revolution in human thought in Christian form. And I think that once one understands that, it becomes quite exciting and quite interesting. And this is exactly what the goal here has been, not to tell people to become Christians or whatever, which, God, this would be a horrible way to tell people to become Christians. What a poor missionary I would be. Instead, to be a missionary of philosophy and of theory, and to try to share some of the joy and the excitement that comes when one realizes the complexity in what appears to be things that we took for granted, that seem to be ordinary, that we thought we understood what Christianity was, but instead it's actually a lot more exciting than that. At least that is my belief. And so what I've tried to do in this lecture is introduce you to some of Žižek's arguments and to explain how they relate to Hegel and Chesterton. I hope that you've enjoyed this session. There's so much more to do here. Like, I was reading a Borges book, The Craft of Verse, a wonderful little volume. I actually have the slipcover here. I like to take them off books. The Craft of Verse, in which he talks about a God as a dead word, and how every word is a dead metaphor, and lots of interesting stuff. But I think we should do that next week. I think we've done enough for today. On that note, thank you guys so much for joining me. It's been my pleasure to start my week with you in philosophical and theoretical fashion. If you'd like to join our learning community, and if you'd like to learn more about these things, I genuinely invite you to join our learning community on Patreon, where we post a Q&A every week. I post edited transcripts. You can download my ebook subscription, all of my lectures as audio files so that you can actually listen to them on the go. And it helps me keep making these videos open access. So if you've enjoyed this, if you'd like to learn more, I'd really appreciate it if you checked out the Patreon by going to www.patreon.com/Jenaline and Julian. And if you're wondering who Jenaline is my wonderful wife who edits the transcripts and who's actually a key part of this project behind the scenes, even though she's not on camera. She is my intellectual companion through life. And for that, I am hugely grateful to her. If you'd like to join us both behind the scenes, please go to www.patreon.com/Jenaline and Julian. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next week.